The jungle took everything but her trigger finger. Before we go any further, if you found this story, stay until the end. What happened to Staff Sergeant Lena Grady in the Darién Gap in the fall of 2019 is the kind of thing that gets buried in classified footnotes and quarterly debrief summaries. It doesn't make the news. It doesn't get the ceremony. What it gets is a line in a report that reads, "Mission parameters unmet, extraction completed, no hostile contact confirmed." 11 words. For what she did in 72 hours with a dislocated shoulder, no radio, and a team that had already written her off. This is that story. Grady had been in the Army for 9 years when she got the assignment. She wasn't looking for recognition. That much becomes clear the moment you talk to anyone who served alongside her. What she was looking for, quietly, methodically, was the work itself. The kind of work that mattered. She had grown up in Spokane, Washington, the youngest of 4, the only one who could field strip a hunting rifle by the time she was 12. Her father hadn't taught her because he thought she'd need it. He'd taught her because she'd asked, repeatedly, until he ran out of reasons to say no. That detail matters. It matters because the entire arc of Grady's military career can be understood through that same dynamic. She asked, they resisted, she waited, she proved, over and over again. At Fort Benning, her marksmanship scores in the qualification range came back so high that the evaluating officer, a man named Cobb who had been doing this for 19 years, looked at the printout, looked at her and said, "Run it again." She ran it again. The scores were higher the second time. Cobb signed off without another word. That was as close to a compliment as she ever got from him. By the time she was assigned to the Joint Intelligence Gathering Unit, operating out of a forward staging area in Colombia, she had 3 deployments, a commendation she never talked about, and a reputation in her platoon that split cleanly down the middle. The men who had worked with her in the field thought she was exceptional. The men who hadn't tended to have opinions that had nothing to do with her file. The unit she was folded into was led by a captain named Declan Ferris. This is where the story actually begins. Ferris was not a bad officer. That's the important thing to understand about him, because the temptation is to make him into something simpler than he was. He was competent. He was organized. He ran tight operations and he cared about his people in the way that career officers learn to care, systematically, within appropriate professional parameters. He didn't dislike Grady. He just didn't quite know what to do with her. She had been placed in his unit by a colonel named Ashworth, who outranked him by enough that he couldn't push back directly. The mission was counter-narcotics with an intelligence overlay. They were tracking a logistics network that had been funneling equipment across the Colombian-Panamanian border. Equipment that had started turning up in places that made the people in Washington very uncomfortable. The kind of places where that equipment gets used on American personnel. Grady's role was sniper overwatch and site assessment. She was there because she was, by any measurable standard, the best qualified person for that role in the unit. Ferris knew that. He also hadn't asked for her, and in the way of men who haven't asked for something, he found it difficult to fully trust it once it arrived. The team had 6 weeks to locate the primary transit hub and document enough of the network structure to hand off to the intelligence side. They weren't there to shut it down. That wasn't their mandate. They were there to map it, photograph it, and get out clean. The first 4 weeks went the way these things go. Slow, careful, frustrating. They moved through the jungle in stages, established observation posts, cataloged movement patterns, confirmed personnel. Grady spent long hours in elevated positions with a long-range optic and a notepad, logging figures, identifying routines, building a picture that the team's intelligence analyst, a quiet, precise man named Weller, began assembling into something usable. She was good at this, better than good. She could hold a position for 8 hours without movement, without water, in heat that made most people's hands shake, and come back with documentation so complete that Weller once told her privately that her observational write-ups read like a case file from someone who had been on scene for a week. Ferris acknowledged this in the way he acknowledged most things she did, without acknowledging it at all. What he did do, at the 5-week mark, was restructure the final phase approach in a way that moved Grady from the primary observation post to a secondary support position. The primary went to a staff sergeant named Brackett, a man Ferris had deployed with twice before, a man he trusted in the way you trust a familiar tool. Brackett was solid. He was not better at this than Grady was. Everyone on the team knew it. No one said it out loud. Grady took the secondary position without comment. If she had thoughts about the reassignment, She kept them in the place where she kept most things, filed away, inaccessible, irrelevant until they weren't. The final phase operation was scheduled for the night of October 14th. A three-team movement to the primary hub location, a compound set back from a tributary river, accessible by two routes, guarded by a rotating detail that Grady had personally timed and documented over the previous 11 days. The plan was solid, the intelligence was good, the window was right. What the plan did not account for was the informant. They found out later, much later, that someone in the regional network had been feeding information to the cartel's security operation for somewhere between 2 and 4 weeks, not a team member. A local contact that the broader operation had been running through a separate channel, a channel that Ferris's unit didn't control and didn't have full visibility into. The kind of structural gap that gets written up in after-action reports and used as training examples for the next decade. On the night of October 14th, at 2217 hours, the three-team element moved into its final approach positions. At 2241 hours, they walked into an ambush. The compound security hadn't been passive, they'd been repositioned, prepared. They knew the approach vectors, which meant they knew things that should only have existed inside the operation itself. The contact was immediate and overwhelming. Not a patrol stumbling onto the team, but a coordinated, layered response that hit all three elements within 40 seconds of the first shot. Grady was in her secondary position, 200 meters off the main axis, elevated on a rocky outcropping that looked down across the primary avenue of approach. She heard the first shots before she saw movement. Then she saw movement everywhere. What happened in the next 4 minutes is something she described later. In a debrief she was required to give, and which was subsequently classified as the clearest she has ever thought in her life. She identified 11 hostile positions from her elevated angle. She began working through them in sequence, prioritizing the crew-served weapon that had pinned Brackett's element in a dry creek bed below. She put that gunner down at 240 meters in low-light conditions with her first shot. She transitioned to the secondary position, another crew-served, repositioning, before the first operator had finished falling. She does not remember the sequence after that with the kind of precision that gets included in official documents. What she remembers is the work, the settling of the breath, the particular geometry of each shot, the way the fire from Brackett's position began to reorganize once the crew served was off the line. At some point during those 4 minutes, she took a round in the left shoulder, not a direct hit, a fragment, most likely, from a near miss against the rock face, or possibly a ricochet. The distinction doesn't matter much in the moment. What it did was separate the ball joint from the socket with a force that she later compared to having the arm removed and then thrown back at her. She kept shooting with the shoulder already going, one-handing the rifle against the rock, and she does not. She has said this clearly, twice, in 2 separate debriefs. Consider that decision to be particularly remarkable. It was the only thing that made sense, she said. The position made sense. The angle made sense. The alternative didn't. The alternative, to be clear, was stopping. At 2253 hours, the contact broke. The hostile element pulled back. Grady held her position, observed, confirmed the withdrawal, and then came off the outcropping by sliding down the back face of the rock with one functional arm and a shoulder that was, by that point, producing a very specific and very insistent signal that she was choosing not to act on. She reached the rally point at 2308. Brackett was there. Weller was there. 2 other team members. Ferris was not. He had been separated during the initial contact and had moved to the alternate rally point 400 meters east, the correct protocol call under the circumstances. Here is where things get complicated. The comm situation had gone sideways during the ambush. The team's primary radio had taken a hit, and the backup was with Ferris at the alternate rally point. Brackett had a personal comms unit, but the encryption had been cycling during the contact, and he'd lost the handshake. Weller had a satellite communicator that worked for data but not voice. What this meant, practically, was that the 2 groups, Grady's element at the primary rally point, Ferris at the alternate, could not establish direct communication. What Ferris knew at 2310, he had 3 of his people at the alternate rally, comms were degraded, there had been significant contact, and the primary rally was 400 meters through jungle that had just been active. What Ferris decided, at 2317, he needed to get his people out. He had a route to the extraction point that didn't pass through the primary rally. He had no confirmed information about who was at the primary or in what condition. He had a wounded operator at the alternate who needed immediate attention. He made his call. He moved his element to extraction. He radioed for the bird. The extraction helicopter arrived at 0034. Ferris's element was on it. Brackett's element was not. This is the moment that one of the operators who was present, a man named Torres, who has since left the service and has spoken on background to at least 2 journalists, describes as the one that still wakes him up. Not the ambush, the departure. "We left 5 people," Torres said. 5 people at a primary rally point in active threat jungle, and we left because we didn't know for certain they were there. That's the logic that got written into the report. We didn't have confirmation. We didn't have confirmation, so we left. The report that Ferris filed upon returning to the staging area at 0312 hours listed the mission as a failed extraction with the status of the primary rally element as unknown. That is the military's way of saying, we don't know who's alive and who isn't. It is a bureaucratic formulation that does a specific kind of violence to the people it refers to. Grady read that report 4 days later. She was remarkably calm about it, by all accounts, but we'll get to that. At 2318 hours, give or take, while Ferris was making his decision 400 meters away, Grady was sitting at the primary rally point with 4 other people, a dislocated shoulder, no functional voice comms, and a map. She looked at the map for a while, then she looked at the jungle around her, then she looked at the 4 people with her. She asked Brackett one question: "What's your assessment of the extraction timeline?" Brackett didn't have one. The comms were gone, the primary route was compromised, and the contingency exfil point was 11 kilometers east, through terrain that had demonstrated it was hostile. He said essentially that they would wait, establish communication when possible, and hold position until extraction or until conditions required movement. Grady nodded. She sat with that for about 90 seconds. Then she said, "The compound." Brackett looked at her. "The compound?" she said again. "We mapped it for 6 weeks. We know the layout, the rotation schedule, the staffing. We know it's concrete. We know the exterior approaches. And we know," she tapped the map, "that there is a communications setup in the primary building that their security element uses for coordination." Brackett told her that the compound was in the direction of the hostile element that had just tried to kill them. "Yes," Grady said. "That's why they won't expect anyone to go toward it." She was not wrong about this. It was also, from a conventional tactical standpoint, a genuinely alarming suggestion. The compound was occupied by a hostile force that had just demonstrated both awareness of their operation and the willingness to engage. Going toward it with 5 people, one of whom had a dislocated shoulder, using a map they'd built from external observation, was the kind of plan that gets someone relieved of command. Brackett was not wrong to hesitate. Grady was not wrong to push. "I'm not saying take the compound," she said. "I'm saying get inside the perimeter, get to the comm setup, use their network to make contact, and get out. Their security pulled back to regroup. They're not expecting a follow-on move in the next 2 hours. The window exists. It will not exist in the morning." She gave him time to think about it. She was not a person who filled silence with noise. She understood that the silence was part of the argument. At 2334 hours, Brackett said, "You're talking about walking into that compound." "Yes," she said, "with a dislocated shoulder. It's the left one." He looked at her for a long moment. Whatever calculation he was running, risk against risk, probability against probability, resolved itself in the way it had to, because the alternative was waiting in the jungle until morning and hoping that Ferris or someone in the chain would come back for them. And everyone at that rally point understood without saying it that the math on that wasn't clean. "Walk me through the entry point," Brackett said. She had watched that compound for 11 days. She knew the rotation gap on the northeast approach, 7 minutes between the guard pass and the camera sweep being manual, and conducted from the elevated position above the main gate, which meant the operator had to physically turn to cover the northeast corner, which meant there was a 4-second gap in the sweep itself during the rotation transition. 4 seconds is enough, if you know exactly where you're going. They moved at 0042, 5 people in the dark, through jungle toward a compound that wanted them dead. Grady set the pace. She moved the shoulder as little as possible, and she did not make sounds about the pain, because sounds were a thing she could control, and the pain was not. So she controlled what she could, and she moved through the rest of it the way she'd been moving through the rest of things her entire career, without allowing it to become the primary variable. The northeast approach was exactly as she had mapped it. The guard rotation came and went. The camera swept. She counted the seconds under her breath. Later, she wouldn't remember having done this, but 2 of the 4 people behind her would confirm it, the quiet cadence of her counting. And then she moved through the gap with the other 4 behind her. Inside the perimeter, she let the compound's own layout do the work. She knew where the external foot traffic patterns ran, which doors were locked, which were on the rotation. She had built this picture from 200 meters and an observation log. Inside the perimeter at 0 distance, the picture was more specific, not less. They reached the communications room at 0118. The door was unlocked. This was one of those small facts that, if you were inclined to read meaning into things, said something about how the compound security had not actually anticipated this particular scenario. Locked doors are for people who think they might be visited. This door was unlocked because no one had thought to lock it, because no one had planned for the contingency of the 5 people they'd left in the jungle walking back in. Inside, 2 operators, a satellite uplink, a bank of handheld radios on charge, and a map on the wall that contained significantly more information about the broader network's transit structure than anything Grady's team had been able to observe from the outside. Weller looked at the map and made a sound that Grady later described as the sound a man makes when he realizes he's been looking at the same puzzle for a month and someone just handed him the box. She gave him 4 minutes. While Weller documented, Grady secured the room. The 2 operators were not given the opportunity to interfere. No shots fired. This is relevant because the report that was eventually written noted specifically that the engagement was conducted without lethal force where avoidable, which is a detail that requires the kind of precise situational control that is very difficult to achieve when your shoulder is producing the kind of signal Grady's was producing at that point. At 0126, Weller had what he needed. At 0131, Grady was on the satellite uplink, using a frequency that she had memorized before departure because she memorized things like that systematically because information you've memorized can't be taken away from you in a firefight. At 0147, she had a voice connection to the staging area. The operations sergeant who took the call would later say that the first thing he thought, hearing a calm, female voice on a compromised satellite frequency out of the Darién Gap at 0147 hours, was that something had gone very wrong in a way he hadn't been briefed on yet. It took him approximately 10 seconds to understand that something had, in fact, gone right in a way no one had anticipated. "This is Staff Sergeant Grady," she said. "Primary rally element, 5 personnel, 0 fatalities. We need extraction. I'm going to give you coordinates." She gave him the coordinates. They were precise. She also gave him a brief summary of the intelligence. Weller had documented, delivered in the measured factual cadence of someone giving a weather report, and the operations sergeant, a man named Dell, who had been doing this job for 11 years, said afterward that it was the most efficient communication he had received under those circumstances in his entire career. Extraction was confirmed for 0340. She led her element out of the compound at 0202, using the same northeast approach in reverse, and they were 2 kilometers east of the compound when she finally allowed herself to stop and acknowledged that the shoulder had been trying to tell her something for approximately 5 hours. Brackett helped her strap the arm. He didn't say much. There wasn't much that needed saying. The helicopter arrived at 0338 2 minutes early. Grady's element was on it. When they reached the staging area, Ferris was there. He had been there since 0312. He had filed his report. He had listed the mission as failed, the primary rally element as status unknown, and he had been sitting with that for just under 3 hours. He saw her come off the helicopter. He walked toward her. She watched him walk toward her. She had the arm in a makeshift sling that Brackett had constructed from a field dressing, and her uniform was the particular color that uniforms get when they've been through jungle for 8 hours, and her face was the face of someone who has been operating for a very long time without sleep or food and has not yet fully allowed herself to be finished. Ferris stopped in front of her. He started to say something. She said, "Sir, I need to get Weller to the intelligence section. He has documentation that needs to go up the chain tonight." Ferris looked at her for a moment. "Your shoulder, after," she said. He let her go. The intelligence that Weller had documented from the wall map inside that compound led, through a chain of subsequent operations that took the better part of 4 months, to the identification and disruption of the primary transit corridor for that network. The disruption was significant. The people who understood the significance were, by the nature of their work, not in a position to be specific about it publicly. What was specific and what was not classified was the after-action finding. It noted that the intelligence recovery had occurred as a direct result of decisions made at the primary rally point during a period when the element was operating without command guidance or communication support. It noted that those decisions had led to the successful exfiltration of all 5 personnel without fatalities. It noted the communications contact established, the intelligence secured, the extraction coordinated. It did not use Grady's name. It referred to her as the primary rally element leader, which was a designation that required someone to make a decision about who had led that element. And the answer to that decision was not bracket, which meant that somewhere in the process of writing that report, someone had understood what had actually happened at 2,334 hours in that jungle. Ferris filed his original mission report, the one listing the mission as failed, 26 minutes before Grady's element landed at the staging area. He did not amend it. The original remained in the system as filed. 3 weeks after the operation, in a conversation that neither party has discussed publicly, Colonel Ashworth called Ferris in for a review of the mission timeline. The specific contents of that conversation are not known. What is known is that Ferris returned from it and subsequently submitted a supplemental addendum to the original report, amending the mission outcome designation from failed to modified success. Grady was not present for any of this. She was aware it was happening. When she was asked, at a much later date, whether she had thoughts about the sequence of events, she said, "I thought about it the way I think about most things I can't affect. I put it somewhere, and I left it there." She was then asked whether she was frustrated. She thought about this for a moment in the particular way she thought about things, not hesitation exactly, but precision. "Frustrated," she said, "assumes I expected something different. The shoulder required surgery. The procedure was straightforward. The recovery was not. Because recovery requires stillness, and stillness was something Grady had always had a complicated relationship with. She was cleared for full duty 7 weeks later, which was 2 weeks ahead of the projected timeline, which surprised no one who had been paying attention. She was recommended for a decoration, the specific designation moving through levels of approval that take the kind of time that these things take. Weller wrote the recommendation himself. He submitted it twice when the first submission was returned for additional documentation. He was asked once, by someone in the review process, whether the recommendation might be more appropriate at a lower level of recognition given the circumstances. Weller told the person who asked this that he was welcome to review the documentation and explain which element of the criteria was not met. The person did not respond with a specific explanation. The recommendation moved forward. At no point in this process did Grady contact anyone about the status of the recommendation. She was aware it existed. She did not ask about it. This is consistent with everything else that can be documented about how she operated. She put the work in, she noted what happened, and she did not expend effort trying to manage outcomes she couldn't control. The decoration was approved 8 months after the operation. The ceremony was small. The staging area in Columbia was long since disbanded. Most of the people who had been there that night were in other places by then, assigned to other things, carrying the events of October 14th in whatever form those events had taken inside each of them. Grady stood in the room where the decoration was presented, and she received it, and she thanked the people who had done the work to see it through. She thanked Weller by name. She mentioned the 4 people who had been at the primary rally point, each by name, in a sentence that gave each name the same weight. She did not mention Ferris. She did not mention not mentioning him. It was simply an absence in what she said, a shaped space where a name was not, and the people in the room who had read the timeline understood what the shape of that space meant, and the people who hadn't didn't need to. There is a word for what Grady did in the Darién Gap, and it is not the word that gets used in citation language or commendation documents. Those documents have their own vocabulary, valor, gallantry, meritorious service, and that vocabulary is not wrong exactly, but it is general in the way that official language is required to be general. The word that fits more precisely is competence, the rare, total, load-bearing kind, the kind that doesn't look for the situation it expects. It looks at the situation it has. The kind that doesn't ask to be acknowledged while it's working, because acknowledgement is downstream of the work, and the work is what's in front of you right now. She counted those seconds in the dark because she had memorized the timing, and the timing was the only thing that would get 5 people through that gap without dying. She went toward the compound instead of away from it because the map in her head said it was the correct move, and she trusted the map in her head because she had built it carefully over 11 days for exactly this kind of moment that she hadn't known was coming. She said after when Ferris asked about the shoulder, because the intelligence had to move first, and she knew that, and she was right. She left Ferris's name out of the ceremony the way she had left the empty magazine at the rally point, deliberately, cleanly, without comment. Some things don't need to be said to be understood. Some absences communicate with more precision than the words would. The slight favoring of the left arm when she shakes hands. The particular stillness she carries when she listens to someone. The fact that she still, to this day, memorizes radio frequencies before deployment because information you've memorized can't be taken from you. These are the things that remain. Not the citation, not the designation on the report, not the amended addendum that moved the outcome from failed to modified success. The fact that 5 people came off that helicopter when none of them should have. That's the whole story. That was always the whole story.